W163 Mercedes ML rear suspension lift by replacing the shocks and the springs and adding a 2-inch spacer on top of the strut assembly. These springs are a little different than what I had used originally. These are Bilsteins with the 3 markings that are available in the US. I was able to find them, and they did a good job lifting the truck, but with all the weight that the car has, I wasn't getting quite what I wanted. So I found these sets of Bilsteins from a friend in Germany. It's got a little bit different markings, you know, the 4 markings instead of the 3. So I'll see exactly how this will change the stance of the vehicle compared to how it used to be. I already replaced it on the left side yesterday, and it went pretty well. We'll see how it goes once the other side is done, and I'll drop the car and see exactly the difference in height. One thing I do differently whenever I work on the ML is, especially because the strut assembly is going to be longer because of usage of this strut spacer, it becomes really difficult to put the strut back onto the suspension if I do what most others have shown that they do, which is drop the control arm here, the lower control arm, from the bolts that hold to the chassis. What I found is that if I actually drop it from the ball joint on the hub assembly, it's a lot easier to be able to put the strut assembly back onto the arm and then onto the ball joint here. There's a lot more room doing it this way than struggle with realigning the bolts that go through the control arm during assembly with all that pressure of the longer strut forcing down. I found it very, very difficult to align those bolts properly without putting so much stress on them. Now we have to get the bottom of the strut assembly, which has a ball joint, into the control arm. And then I have to lift this control arm in order to be able to get the spindle ball joint onto it. The ball joint is held to the spindle using a 21mm nut. There's a 7mm hex nut inside that I have to use to hold it in place while tightening. The tightening spec on this nut is about 65 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to go by feel, and then I'll see if I can get the torque wrench on there. That's good. Next, we have to mount the upper arm ball joint onto the spindle. The upper arm is held using a 18mm nut. So I'm going to get a few threads tightened on this nut, and then I have to put a locking pliers on the edge of it so it prevents it from spinning the ball joint shaft. The torque value on this is about 62 foot-pounds, if I remember correctly, but again, hand tighten it by feel. Next, we have to swing the spindle around so we can put the caster arm rod back onto the spindle here. May have to lower the jack a little bit to loosen it up. Actually, I think what's happening is that I need to lift it because the ball joint is binding and preventing me from spinning the spindle. There you go. So a bit of an odd thing here. So normally I don't find any standard size hardware on this, but the hex size for this ball joint here is 7/32. I don't know if it's been rounded off before or something, that the metric size 6 is not fitting. I'll lower the assembly now and then check to make sure everything is okay. Okay, next I'll tighten the 18mm nut that goes under the shock, and then also the 18mm nuts for the upper control arm. I have pulled them all the way out in the slots to make sure that I get the most positive camber, and then I'll have to go get an alignment done once I'm sure that everything is working okay and the ride height's okay, and then I may have to actually raise the ride height in the front with the torsion bars to make sure everything is even. Looks good. The torque rating on these nuts is about 89 or 90 foot-pounds, and it's important that you do this while the car is up, otherwise they will move back into the slot and you will get a lot of negative camber. The last thing remaining is to put back the bracket that holds the wiring for the ABS sensor. For now, I'm going to leave the sway bar off the car. I just want to see how it rides without it. If it actually is very stable, I may leave it off so I can get a little bit more articulation on some off-roads. And I'll see if that helps anything. But otherwise it looks good. One thing I've noticed though is when the control arm was pushed up with the jack, when the spring was under tension, if you notice these lower springs, they have a sleeve around them. This is the soft portion. These are progressive springs. It's a soft portion of the spring, and they compress pretty much on top of each other. But the compression is still less than what it used to be. And then on top of that, the lowest coil seems to be rather stiff, because I remember the old coil used to bind against this coil as well, the second coil. So this seems to be a little bit stronger. And then the upper coils, I guess, where the stiffest part of the spring is, they seem to have a little bit more space between the coils compared to what I remember the older ones being. So we'll see if this is going to work as expected. Now that I checked everything's okay, I'm going to tighten the lower control arm bolts. These tighten to 100 foot-pounds. I won't quite tighten them to the full 100 until I put the tires back on and drop the car. But I'll get it up there. I'll probably put about 70 foot-pounds, 75 foot-pounds, and then once the car drops, the bushing inside will rotate with the car, so that way you're not pre-stressing the bushing. That'll cause premature wear. Before putting on the fender liner and the tire, I want to try something. The rear, when I'm going reverse, sometimes I hear a loud pitch from this side, from the brakes here. So I want to take out the pads, clean them, and see if there's something I can do about that. The V8 calipers make this job very easy. These are Brembo calipers, so you just drive out the nuts and then the pads come out without having to remove the calipers. And I'll just use a spreader to push the pads a little bit out so I can take them out. This should be okay. Let's see. There we go. I'll take a look at how they are and clean them. I'll be right back. Clean out the pins, and I'll put a little bit of anti-seize on these as well. Last thing I want to do is just use some brake cleaner to clean the rotor. Now I'll put on the fender liner and then finally put the tire on and see how this whole project is going to look like. There are 6 of these 10mm plastic nuts. I'm just going to put them on and then I'll tighten them gently with the gun. Same with that. Alright, we'll put the tire next. Now that I put some weight on the car, on the tires, I'll tighten the bolts to 110 foot-pounds and then tighten the lower control arm bolts. So the car's on the ground now. It looks good. There's quite a bit more space between the tire and the wheel well. But again, I haven't driven the car yet, so once I drive, things may change. It may settle a little bit. But I hope that it'll keep its stance like this, and then depending on, after I do the alignment, depending on how the front looks, I may have to make some slight adjustments to the torsion bar height. We're right about 37 inches, which is good. Typically stock is 33, 34, so I'm hopeful. One measure that I use for height is to see if I can stand under the hatch when it's open. Typically my head touches it. Yeah, looks good.